Hi, my name is Varisha, and I'm a teacher of the Ashaya's Ascension meditation techniques. And this video is an introduction to the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. The Yoga Sutras are a very ancient Vedic text, and it outlines the growth of consciousness in the individual person. And it's like a roadmap, and it illustrates the mechanics of the transformation that someone undergoes through meditation, through growth of consciousness. The presentation that I'm doing today, it's based on a translation of the Yoga Sutras, and the title of the book is Enlightenment by MSI, and I'm just using that material as a basis and then elaborating from there on certain points. So, the Yoga Sutras, there are 196 sutras. A sutra is a short, concise statement, and these statements are in Sanskrit, a very ancient language. And Sanskrit is like a language of consciousness. When we use any mantras in meditation for Vedic meditations, they're in Sanskrit. So it's a very powerful language, and it's some would describe Sanskrit as a perfect language. So we start with the wholeness when we talk about the Yoga Sutras. So we do each sutra, and these ones are selected. There's 196 sutras, so I'm narrowing them down to the ones that are easiest to talk about and experience and the most tangible to play around with intellectually. So with the Yoga Sutras, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each one of them and go over the pronunciation of the sutra. Now, you don't need to know anything about Sanskrit, and this is a fun thing just to try and see how you like it. I'm going to go over the recitation, and what I recommend is that you try it along with me. You're probably at your home, in your room. I mean, there's no one around who's going to see you making strange noises and sounds and things like that. So I invite you just to try these along with me. When we recite the actual sutra, it activates something inside our own consciousness. There's an experience that we develop just by saying these sounds. So that's the first thing that we're going to try, is just reciting the sutra. And then we're going to go into the parts of meaning contained within the sutra. The sutra is a statement of fullness, of wholeness. There's many, many different levels of meaning contained in there. So first we experience the wholeness, then we go into the parts of that wholeness, then explore them from an intellectual level. So the first Yoga Sutra is, I'm going to read this, and if you like to read it along with me, I recommend trying it. The first Yoga Sutra is Atha Yoga Nushasanam. Atha Yoga Nushasanam. Let's try it together. Atha Yoga Nushasanam. And the key thing is, don't worry if you're getting it exactly right. Just give it a try. I mean, even if it's just close to what the actual vibration or energy of the statement is, you'll still get the effect. And you'll notice this from time to time. Okay, so let's go into the meaning. The first Yoga Sutra literally means, now the teaching of yoga. Yoga meaning union. And the word order in Sanskrit can be different, so, one thing might come before another in the actual sutra. So we'll play around with that a little bit while we're going over these. So, the surface level of meaning here is just like, this is, a prelude to everything that follows. Now is the teaching of yoga. But there's a little more meaning that we can go into on that. And if you'd like to read the actual translation done by MSI, I would recommend it. He's a master of Sanskrit and the meaning levels. We're going to add in a little additional material just for some additional translation and meaning. So in Vedic literature, it's said that the very first sound of the whole text contains the fullness of the meaning of the whole thing. So in Sanskrit, each sound has a certain vibration. Sanskrit is meant to use our mouth in the optimal way, and our vocal cords and our articulation. It's like how in yoga we're optimizing the use of the physical body. So with Sanskrit, it's the same thing. We're optimizing the use of our voice, of our speech, and expressing powerfully that way. So the sound it's the most basic sound. It's the sound of fullness. If you just make the sound and notice how it feels, if you just go you notice how your throat is open, your mouth is open. So the actual way that your physiology is making that sound is openness. And so that's the leading into the actual meaning of that sound. The sound is a fullness of infinite, of unboundedness. So you could say that the entire Yoga Sutras are about the infinite, are about unboundedness. And ultimately it's integrating the unboundedness that's already existing all the time with our own individual method of functioning. So we could say that's a good lead-in to the science of yoga, the science of union. And you might say the union of what with what. So there's this individual self, or what appears to be our own individual self, and we have a sense of who we are, the things that we like, the people we interact with, what we look like, and those are based on a lot of individual assumptions and that kind of thing. So there's the idea that there is this individual self, and then there's a cosmic self. And so the idea is that this individual self becomes the cosmic self, and that can be experienced if we're in meditation. We can experience a state called samadhi, and samadhi is the union of that individual self with the cosmic self. And the ironic part is that a lot of people find that during that experience there's no sense of an individual self, it's only the cosmic self. So that's the idea. So the Yoga Sutras are about the teaching of union of the small self with the large self, ultimately just experiencing the large self. So in the word atta, we start out with the sound meaning the infinite. The ta sound, it can mean, one meaning is to give or to bestow. So the infinite, and if this is capitalized, it's still the same sound. This is this So the infinite giving back to the infinite. So we could take that as meaning the self dissolving into the cosmic self and experiencing that cosmic self. Experiencing the infinite through meditation. Yoga literally just means union, and you'll hear that a lot in different workshops and that kind of thing. The word anushasana means teaching, but there's a few different parts we can break down here. The first word anu means again or repetition. And so if we experience a state of samadhi, it's a state of bliss, of perfection, of unboundedness, of infinite self. And so most people will experience that now and again in certain activities and certain experiences. It'll just blossom and unfold. It's really everyone's birthright to experience that. So the idea is that with yoga, we're systematizing the experience of samadhi. We're allowing ourselves to experience that more consistently and more often until it's a solid experience. So there's anu, the experience of repetition or again. Shas can mean stillness, is MSI's translation that he uses in his book. So shas can be, the repeated experience of stillness. And anam is just the suffix that gives it the context, meaning that it's a teaching, it's a thing. So to come back to the overall meaning, we could be atta, meaning now, or the infinite giving to the infinite. The experience of being present in the now is the same as experiencing the infinite. So now the teaching of union is experienced by the repetition of stillness. Stillness might seem as if it has no qualities, but I think we'll discover in time that there is more qualities contained within that stillness. The stillness can be wholeness, and within that can be many different qualities: creativity, joy, bliss, any different things. And so the experience of stillness is one of fullness. It just takes some repetition and some back and forth to refine the perception to see that. So the Yoga Sutras are connected. Sometimes one sutra will follow into the next with its meaning. They're kind of connected in their meaning and the form that they take in the discourse. So the second Yoga Sutra, I'm going to read this, and I invite you to try it along with me. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Let's try it together. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. And the fullness of the translation is that yoga, or union, is chitta, consciousness, vritti, with movement, nirodha, stillness, with the stillness of movement. So to go into the parts of the meaning, yoga is union, chitta means consciousness. You'll hear this used a lot of different ways in different commentaries. So the way that I like to explain it, and I like to keep things really simple, because complicated intellectual meanings can sometimes not really capture the fullness of something. So to keep it simple, chitta means consciousness. It could mean my individual consciousness, my own individual awareness, that which inhabits this body and is aware of its thoughts and its actions. Chitta could also mean the cosmic consciousness. It could mean the Atma, the consciousness that exists everywhere. Ultimately, when we grow more in our awareness, there's less distinction between an individual self and a cosmic self. So ultimately, chitta just means consciousness. Vritti means movement, and the beginning vrit, it means to turn or to change direction or to change a flow of something. So when we're going throughout our day, there's always lots of thoughts going on, and some studies estimate that we think 90,000 thoughts a day. So there's constant activity and constant change of our focus from one thing to another. And it could be an object of attention, it could be our senses going out on a particular object or person, or it could be the internal, it could be our thoughts, and our thoughts connected to what's going on outside. So the way that our mind usually works is constantly in the past or in the future and jumping very rapidly from one thing to the next. One thing that I like to mention is when you're watching TV and the commercials come in, they increase the volume level by 10 decibels and try to get your attention to jump from one thing to the next to grab you in there. So the idea with meditation is to go from this less natural state of functioning to a more natural state of functioning, to use the mind as it's intended to be used and how our physiology responds to it. So the idea is to go from a functioning of chaos and activity to that of silence and focus, and within that, joy, happiness, and many, many other things that we'll discover. And so then nirodha is stillness, the silence. And we could say that when we experience samadhi, we're going from a level of great activity, and if we use a technique, it becomes less and less and less and less and less. And then we transcend that threshold and experience complete silence. It's like with temperature, there's the temperature of absolute zero. Molecules are vibrating very rapidly at room temperature or higher, and then as they get colder and colder and colder, they're vibrating less and less and less and less and less until they get to the point where they're absolutely still. So we can see these things in nature and in science. The same principles apply to what's going on in our mind and what's going on in our universe around us. So to come back to the fullness of the meaning, yoga, or union, the experience of the union of the individual self with the cosmic, is chitta, our consciousness, our awareness, with vritti, the movement still. So the third sutra is connected to the last one, and this one we're going to try the pronunciation first. Tada drashtuhu svarupe avasthanam tada drashtuhu svarupe avasthanam. Let's try it together. Tada drashtuhu svarupe avasthanam. And there's so much beauty in the levels of meaning on these. This is one of my favorites. So the meaning is that when consciousness experiences itself with movement still, when we experience that true form of ourself, then the seer, and we'll talk about the seer in a minute, then the seer resides, avasthanam, in the true form of the self. So the idea is that there's our individual consciousness that inhabits this body, that we are not necessarily all these things. There's been studies that show that the atoms in our body are replaced all the time, and our mind is directing these atoms and how they're constantly replacing all of our internal organs. And I've heard that every year that 98% of the atoms are replaced. So, this thing is not is not really who we are. It reflects the way that our mind is and the way that we're creating our body. But this physical machinery is constantly in a state of flux. So, if we are the chitta, the individual consciousness that inhabits this body, then we are the seer in this sutra. And as the seer, we are aware of thought, we are aware of our action, our movement. And so the idea is that we aren't necessarily our thoughts either. Our thoughts might be there, but we don't actually have to identify them. We can objectively witness them, and we can function certainly by being aware of our thoughts instead of being swept down the river of our thoughts. So the idea here is that our chitta, our consciousness, is like the seer, that which is aware of the thoughts and our action and our daily life. So then, the seer, in the true form, and this word is fantastic. I love going to the meaning of this one. So the self, we could say that sva is the true form of the self. The V in the middle is it represents permanence or stability. It's that which doesn't come and go. So we could have this idea of who we are and the things that we like and what we like to do and all that, the individual idea of a self. But sva is like the cosmic self, that which is our true self. So our possessions and our relationships may come and go. What are we left with after all that? And that's the true form of the self that resides, quietly witnessing underneath that. So in Sanskrit, there's the root of the word that carries the essence of its meaning, and the ending kind of gives it a little direction, a little context. So sva, the true self, the word rupa it means the form. So this is the form of the true self. The A at the end means on or in. So in this case, in the form of the true self is the meaning of svarupe. And avasthanam is a beautiful word. You can feel avastha. If you just feel how your breath comes out when you make that sound, it's fantastic. To elaborate on those sounds, so ava and then sta. So ava means something like in, sta means stability. So I think of it like the concrete foundation to a house. If you're rooted in silence, if you're rooted in the internal experience of stillness, that's the ultimate stability. If you're totally rooted in that peace and in that internal silence, nothing can shake you. And that's the idea with yoga, with experiencing samadhi, making it a more constant experience until it's solid. So that's like the foundation. So avastha means residing in, and solidly residing in. So, the overall meaning of the sutra, when we're experiencing the stillness of consciousness, when movement subsides and we experience stillness, then the seer is residing stably in the true form of the self. Now we're going to talk about our different kinds of thoughts that we have, because thoughts have a lot of relationship to our experience of peace, our experience of stillness, our experience of joy, of everything in our life. Thoughts, they change that experience constantly, and our awareness is used to constantly going from one thing to the next. So constantly having a changing experience instead of a focused experience, instead of a powerful present experience. So we're going to talk about thoughts a little bit in this next sutra. So for the pronunciation, vrittayaha panchatayaha klishta klishta. Vrittayaha panchatayaha klishta klishta. And let's try it together. Vrittayaha panchatayaha klishta klishta. Okay, so the translation of this sutra, the movements, the vrittis, the thoughts, panchatayaha, are of 5 kinds. Klishta klishta, and these kinds can be sorted into 2 categories, as either destructive or creative thoughts. So a lot of our busy thoughts throughout the day are not terribly productive. You know, they're things like, oh, Susie said this at work to me today, and oh, we're going to talk about that tomorrow. And things like, oh, what am I going to make for dinner tonight? Who am I going to see later? And, you know, if you become aware of your thoughts more and more, you'll notice that there's all this chatter going on. And, you know, it's like some things are useful, but, you know, 90-something% of it is just busy activity, and it's exhausting, it's stressful, and it's just how our mind is accustomed to working in modern life. So, the movements of the mind, Patanjali was a self-realized teacher, and with that clarity of experience, of consciousness, he was able to formulate in these sutras just, you know, very concrete descriptions of things. So he organizes thoughts into 5 categories, and those 5 categories can be either destructive or creative. So the vast majority of thoughts are busy activity, and they help bind the mind. If we have habitual thought patterns that, you know, I don't have enough money to get, you know, this thing that I want, I don't have enough money to live in the home that I want, you know, I'm not good looking enough for this person that I desire. The same thoughts are going around and around in our mind again and again, reinforcing those same thought patterns. So the idea here is that the majority of thoughts are not very creative and functioning. And so in the Vedic literature, there's these opposites, pairs of opposites that come together, and opposites together, they create a contrast that can help us recognize them more. And the idea is that by that contrast, by that polarity, we can use that as a tool to gain freedom of the mind, freedom of the machinery of the mind and our thinking. So there are the destructive thoughts. Most of the busy stuff that we're thinking throughout the day keeps our old thought patterns and our old limitations in place. So what are the creative thoughts? In general, a lot of people just find the value in positive thoughts and positive thinking, positive expression, and there's certainly so much value to that. If you're interacting with people in your profession or in your day-to-day routine, just the positive thinking, if you praise someone for something, you know, if you think they're a great musician, if they're a great cook, you know, of course, you're always praising and praising, and they feel gratitude in return, and this cycle just keeps going and going. So there's some thoughts that are just positive in nature. But to take that one level further, there are some thoughts that are truly liberating to the mind. So what are those thoughts? Well, for any teaching, in any true teaching, some teachings have not stood the test of time. They can get distorted from one teacher to the next, from one generation to the next. So any form of meditation was a very pure teaching at its inception. But the test of time is how well it survives all these generations and all these interpretations, and if the experience is what the focus is, rather than the intellectual interpretation of an experience. So the truly liberating thoughts are the techniques to liberate the mind. the series of techniques, the vehicle for the mind to move inward, for the mind to experience samadhi, those are the truly liberating thoughts. And so we're going to explore that a little bit more in the next sutra. So we talked about the 5 different kinds of thoughts, and we're leading into the 5 different varieties of thought as categorized by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras. So we're going to try reciting this one. Pramana viparyaya vikalpa nidra smrtayaha. I'll go over it a little bit slower. Pramana viparyaya vikalpa nidra smrtayaha. Let's try it together. Pramana viparyaya vikalpa nidra smrtayaha. So the 5 kinds of thoughts are pramana, upward thoughts, viparyaya, downward thoughts or binding thoughts, vikalpa, dreaming, nidra, sleep, or smrtayaha, or smriti, memory. So we'll go into these a little bit, and it just provides a little illustration on the last sutra. So pramana is a very interesting word. I like to just break it down a little bit. So mana can mean the mind, or the machinery of the mind and its use. And if you think of the word mantra, it starts with mana, meaning the mind, and tra, together it's the vehicle that the mind uses to gain a different experience. So pramana, the prefix pra can mean the ultimate or the foremost, and mana literally means the mind. So it's like the ultimate use of the mind, the ultimate food for the mind, or the most optimal method of use of the mind. So to put it a little more in context, pramana means upward thoughts or uplifting thoughts, thoughts that free the mind from bondage or from its habitual thought patterns. Viparyaya, and this means downward thoughts, literally. It can mean the busy thoughts, the thoughts that we're constantly thinking throughout the day, the thoughts that bind the mind. So from the last sutra we have liberating thoughts, the pramana, the downward thoughts or the busy thoughts, the viparyaya, and then we just have these other categories: vikalpa, dreaming, nidra, sleep, and smriti, memory. So with dreaming, it's a more abstract experience. It's they say that in the dream state that our mind is physiologically writing our experiences from the day to our long-term memory. So it's determining what to keep and what to let go of. So it's how our body processes the stress of sensory experience that we pick up throughout the day. Because it's not like we remember everything, because our mind just has trouble storing all that information. So it's throwing off all this stress and this sensory experience, and so it comes together and it forms, some type of an imagery and that kind of thing. So dreaming in general, it's just said to be the experience of the body processing and releasing that stress from the day's activity. So if you've had some particularly weird experiences during your day, you might have some particularly strange experiences, during your dream cycle. And that's not to say that there might not be profound dreams, because we can experience a cognition, we can experience, like a premonition or something that is an experience of truth or of that true form of the self. We can experience that in any state of consciousness, so sometimes we may experience that in our dreams as well. But in general, dreams are a little more abstract because it's a combination of all these sensory experiences being thrown off by our nervous system. Nidra is sleep. So between our dream cycles at night, there's the experience of the body resting and just experiencing quiet and nothingness. There is sleep, and then there's a dream, then there's sleep, and then there's a dream, back and forth. And then smriti is memory, and memory is a very interesting thing in the journey of expanding consciousness, because we tend to retain more. Memory becomes perfected. So if we're constantly like with all the stress in our nervous system, we're actually constantly filtering out a lot of the sensory information that's coming in. Not a conscious thing, but just how our brain is used to processing things. So you notice that sometimes children will have enhanced perception. You know, they might see things that adults may not see anymore. So the idea is that with all our stress and, you know, the way that our mind and our body are used to functioning in modern society, that there's an absence of experience. We're filtering out these things that are coming to us sometimes. So as we release that stress from the body through the expansion of consciousness, as we let all the impurities leave our system, then a certain clarity develops. And in individuals who have gained their ultimate spiritual understanding, there's this clarity of memory as well. They could read something one time and still remember it. And so it's something you may have experiences of from time to time. Just all of a sudden you need to have a certain phone number or a certain person's name, and it's just there. So it's just another example of how our thoughts change as our experience of consciousness change. And so then as we experience more silence on the inside, as we experience stillness and that state of samadhi more in our daily activity, the downward thoughts become less and less. The busyness becomes less and less. Our thoughts become fewer and more focused and more creative. Okay, so our next sutra, it illustrates the relationship between our thoughts and our approach to silence if we're going inward through meditation. So this one, we'll go over the pronunciation, is Abhyasa Vairagyabhyam Tanirodha. A little slower. Abhyasa Vairagyabhyam Tanirodha. And let's try it together. Abhyasa Vairagyabhyam Tanirodha. And that's the fullness of the expression. You might notice that your body might settle down, your mind might settle down a little bit as we're reciting these. So it's a fun thing to notice sometimes. Abhyasa literally means approach. So what does approach mean? If our mind is constantly busy and we're only using 5 or 10% of our brain and what it's really capable of, then we're usually functioning from a limited perspective of the mind. Sure, the full range of experience is always available, but just the way that our mind has built itself and organized itself, it's used to experiencing just a surface state, limited forms of thoughts. And so the idea is that the mind can get freed up, those resources can get freed up, and we can experience more and more of our full potential, and that the limitation and the stress gets replaced by joy and happiness and creativity and whatever it is that you're really meant to experience. So abhyasa is approach. It's approach to the silence. It's approach to that experience of samadhi it's always there. It's just that we're not aware of it a lot of the time. So what we need to experience that, because we're so used to being caught up in all these 90,000 thoughts a day, so we're always forgetting about this silence that's inside. So approach is using a vehicle. It's using something from the surface of the mind that draws it inward. So in the case of the Ishaya's Ascension, we have our techniques, we call them ascension attitudes, and it's our vehicle to go from the surface level of thinking to deeper and deeper levels until we transcend into that experience of absolute fullness. And each stage has more and more, it's more and more peaceful, more and more creative, more and more powerful, and then you transcend into an experience of fullness. And people experience this regularly. It's just that we don't experience the unbounded nature of ourselves on a consistent basis. We'll have certain experiences, and for me, I've had things like when we had a wood stove in the house when I was a teenager, I'd be out chopping wood for the wood stove, and not to be too stereotypical with the chop wood and carry water kind of analogy, but it's true in my case. So if I was chopping wood, I would just get into the rhythm of it. My breath would come into that rhythm. My emotions would come into that rhythm. My thought process would just find a place of stillness. And so when I was doing that activity, I would just enter this space of just peace and fluidity, and no sense of stress, no sense of what happened earlier at school, or what was what I was going to have for dinner. It was just being fully present. So we all have these experiences. The thing is that usually we just experience them every now and again. And so the true gift of meditation is to cultivate that experience, to be fully present more and more of the time until we're fully present all the time. So, abhyasa is approach from the busy level of thinking to more and more quiet, and then absolute silence in the mind. Vairagya is a new topic we're going to talk a little bit about. So Vairagya is witnessing. When we have our thoughts, if I'm thinking about, on my way to work, this driver cut me off, and he totally ignored that, the light that was there, I didn't use a turn signal. So what happened then? I went from, being present and, doing my job at work, and, I was in my drive to work again. So what happened there? I wasn't really present with what I was doing and what I needed to do. My mind wasn't focused. It was tied up in this stuff. So Vairagya is witnessing. And this is very ancient stuff. I mean, we can experience this tangibly in our meditation practice, but, Patanjali was talking about this before the time of Christ. So it's a very ancient principle. So Vairagya is witnessing or detachment. So Vairagya is witnessing or detachment. And Vairagya the idea is that we're watching our thoughts. And the thing is, when we sit back and just watch our thoughts for a little bit, it's like there's some that have been going by all the time that we didn't realize for a really long time. So if we're just closing our eyes and watching our thoughts, there's more and more that we pick up all the time. And with so many thoughts, there's so many that we're not noticing all the time. And so, we'll be in our story, about what I need to say to my significant other later, and then it's like, oh. And then it's just coming back. And abhyasa is the tool to come back. Vairagya is letting more and more of those thoughts pass by, and letting them pass by without them letting affect our peace. So that brings us to our next part. This lovely ending here, byam, means both or together. And I love that impression that it gives you of duality. Approach to the silence, witnessing thought. Approach to the silence, witnessing thought. When we experience the silence, our mind settles down, and because our mind and our body are connected, the body settles down to very deep rest. When the body settles down, it starts to heal itself. It starts to recover, because it always wants to. It just wants the chance to do that. So if we're using abhyasa, our technique, and just letting the mind drop inward, our body drops inward to a very deep level of rest. And so when that happens, the mind becomes active again because there's the healing going on. And so there's the reciprocal motion of healing in the body, creating more movement in the mind, the stresses moving out of the nervous system. So we're going back and forth between approach to the silence, coming out on thought, realizing we're coming out on thoughts, and approaching the silence again using our technique. So it's always a back and forth. Sometimes there's a lot of thoughts, sometimes not so many. It could be different depending on what we ate today, if we exercised today, if we slept a lot, if we didn't sleep. So the number of thoughts can be greater or smaller. It's going to be different all the time. The idea is that with growth of consciousness, we're approaching the silence from whatever's going on that day, and just coming back out on thoughts and approaching again, and just letting it be gentle and natural as it's intended to be. So then tanirodha is the movement stilling. So this is more noticeable on a busy day. If I've been running around all day with errands, if I have a lot of sugar in my system, there's going to be a lot of busyness, a lot of activity. So then, I'll approach the silence, and then I'll start thinking about some stuff, and then I'll approach, use the technique again, and come inward, and then come out and some stuff, and then, gradually, little bit by little bit by little bit, it'll settle down. And it's on those busy days that in my own experience I notice that tremendous bliss and relief from just dropping into that silent space. Because when it just naturally, through the use of the technique, does that, then it's just so blissful by comparison. If you're very busy, then if you become very still, it's a very gratifying experience sometimes. So that's the essence of this one. Approach, abhyasa, and detachment or witnessing, vairagya, both of those together, approaching the silence through a technique, witnessing by not becoming attached to the activity, those things together help the movements to still. And so we're going to go into a little commentary on abhyasa, on approach to silence. And this is how we're going to wrap up the material here. So this one, we're going to go over it, and the black text is that's the Sanskrit that we're doing. This one's a little longer, so we're combining. So this one, vitarka, vichara, ananda, asmita, rupa, anugamat, sampragyataha. A little slower. Vitarka, vichara, ananda, asmita, rupa, anugamat, sampragyataha. Let's try it together. Vitarka, vichara, ananda, asmita, rupa, anugamat, sampragyataha. And if you notice the mechanics of how these sounds flow together, you have a lot of ahs in here. And you have an ah here, an ah that blends together with the next word, ananda, asmita, and so there's many ah sounds in here. It kind of gives us a feeling of that vibration, that it's a lot about the infinite, it's a lot about expansion. So this is a description of abhyasa, an elaboration of the different stages of abhyasa. So the idea is that we're going from the surface of the mind to the most still and expanded state of the mind. So vitarka is the surface level, the very busy level, the least creative level, the most superficial form of thought. Vichara is the meaning level, the more intellectual level, the more left brain level. Ananda is the feeling level, emotions, and in this case, ananda literally means bliss. So the different levels of emotions culminating in bliss being the highest experience of the feeling level. Asmita is the knowing level, the knowing of truth or experiencing that truth. And I would say knowing the different laws of nature, flowing in harmony with those laws at that very deeper level. And then rupa is the stages, meaning that, if we're dropping in, if we're doing our technique, our abhyasa, our ascension attitude, in the case of the Ishayana's ascension, we're going from the surface, through the meaning, through the feeling, through the knowing, in stages. And then anugamat, these develop, sampragyataha, another one of my favorite words. So, sam means union with, or identification with would be a good example in this case. Pra, we saw this one time before. Pra means the highest or the fullest. And then gya, it means knowledge. So together, sam, pra, gyataha, union with the highest form of knowledge, or identification with the highest form of knowledge. So we could say that that's the experience of samadhi. We could say that's the experience of cosmic consciousness, of the fullness of the universal, experiencing the universal self. So, one thing I think of is that how many different meditation practices may have become subject to some interpretation over time. They might be experience more of the contemplation level, like the meaning level, thinking about spiritual concepts, spiritual practices, and that kind of thing. They might be more on the feeling level or the affirmation level, positive thoughts, but still it might keep the mind in this middle level without reaching the full experience of what the mind and the body are capable of experiencing. Or even of the knowing level of discourses about the laws of nature, how they affect our physiology and our mind, of all those things about conceptually we could believe that our life is perfect and that things that are coming to us are for our spiritual growth, and these are wonderful things, and they're probably true from a certain perspective. But there's the experience of thinking about a spiritual concept and experiencing the concept. So it's important not to get the two confused as the same thing, because intellectually knowing something is very different from actually experiencing it. So together, and this describes the techniques in the Ashaya's Ascension. From the surface level of thinking, our abhyasa, or our practice of approach, is using that mechanical technique. So we introduce it from the surface, no matter how busy our day is, how busy our mind is. We introduce the technique from the surface, and the technique has three parts. The meaning part, the part that engages or brings into coherence the left brain, the logical brain, the thinking part of the brain. The part that engages the feeling part, the emotional part. So there's that emotional part that it engages. And then the knowing part, the knowing that our life is perfect the way that it is, or that our body and our physical world is perfect the way that it is, and that it's there for a reason to help us grow. Or just that our connection between ourselves and the cosmic self, if that connection is wholly loving and accepting, that's probably the most important of them all. So the three things together, meaning, feeling, and knowing, if the technique includes all three of these, it charms the mind to a deeper level. It's not getting stuck in contemplation about wonderful spiritual concepts. It's not getting stuck in trying to generate feelings of emotions or of positivity. These are all great, but we want to charm the mind beyond that, to knowing spiritual truth. And then from there, there's this threshold we can cross. And the threshold is that of union, of yoga. And so, sampragyataha, the union with the highest knowing. We're not just settling for part of the experience. We're not settling. we're going for the whole thing. And so that's what any true meditation technique will do. It'll bring you from the surface limited stage through the experience of letting the mind be charmed by something it's not going to chip at and try to figure out, going through the feeling stages, culminating in bliss, experiencing spiritual truth and knowing of those truths, and then experiencing everything, the totality. And so that's what samadhi is. That's what the experience of Atma is, or the higher self, or cosmic truth. It has a lot of different names, and you've all experienced that at some time or another. And if you look back, there will be a few things that'll jump out with you. It's every now and again. For the average person, the mind is constantly active, constantly thinking. So when the mind is able to slip beyond that, it experiences wholeness and completeness. And that's what we want to cultivate, to use our mind at its full potential, optimize our health and our body, because if the mind is functioning optimally, it's going to keep creating the body in the perfect way, or approaching that state. It's a little back and forth. So that's the idea. And to me, this is a good way to summarize the approach, the science of union. And it takes some consistent practice. It's not something you can do on and off. I mean, it's great to have experiences occasionally, but we want to systematize them, make them consistent, and live our life from that space. So that's the introduction to the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I hope you've enjoyed it. My name is Varisha, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you.